2 days from now, the START treaty expires. The last of the nuclear limitations arms treaties expires and goes into void. That would seem to be more urgent than anything that may or may future be involved in Ukraine itself. That should prioritize the interest of the entire West, especially the United States, in keeping those limitations on both sides to lower the chance for any kind of mutually assured destruction in the future. And yet, that seems to be off the table both in Europe and the United States, if we can just be honest. What do you think about that? Well, I am extremely worried about it, as I can tell you are. I think this is an absolutely terrible situation. For the first time since the 1960s, we either have no nuclear arms control at all, which is what we have at the moment, and we don't have any talks about nuclear arms control. I mean, discussions about nuclear arms control and nuclear restrictions on nuclear weapons began in the 1960s, and now we have nothing. And we are in this terrifying void with weapons, the power of which it is well impossible to overstate. They can destroy humanity. You would have thought that would be the overriding priority. We don't have to like the Russians. We don't have to agree with them. We may oppose completely what they're doing in Ukraine, but at least we have this need, this common need, surely, to prevent the ultimate disaster, and we're doing nothing. The Russians said, well, let's at least extend this by a year, and the president seemed to be saying this is a good idea, but he's not moved forward with it. The countries of Europe, the nations of Europe, where all the great wars have previously been fought and who should know more about war than anyone else, they don't seem to be worried about it at all. And we are in this terrible situation that we now face. And we're in very, very uncharted waters from this point on. And that makes me very, very worried, as I think it should everybody. And let me just ask, kind of give us an insight here into the extent that you're aware. What is the conversation like in Europe, whether it's in capitals or there in the UK, when this topic even comes up? Because it would seem, again, an obvious answer that priority should be given to lowering the threat of nuclear weapons use than any kind of specific border dispute between two countries or even a war between two countries, so that everybody else all has success and less risk. But that's not happening. What is the conversation that? Or have we gotten to the place where the images of 1945 in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are so distant that it's just like an old movie reel and it's no longer reality? People aren't afraid of nuclear war. I'm afraid it may very well be the second. I don't get the sense that anybody is seriously debating this. I've not seen a single debate, for example, in the British Parliament about it. If there has been one, I've missed it. And certainly if there was one, it didn't attract a great deal of attention. When people talk about Russia now, they don't talk about arms control. They talk about war as if war is something war with Russia. A nuclear power is something that not only might happen, but which we must prepare for in a way that suggests no limitations on what sort of weapons that we should have. But on the contrary, a military buildup. You know, I've been hearing extraordinary stories about some people in Poland advocating that Poland should acquire nuclear weapons, which would be a complete disaster. There was an article in the Financial Times that suggested that there are people in Sweden who are talking about the same thing for Sweden. I mean, these are terrible things. And I think that, well, this debate ought to be taking place, and it is very, very disturbing that it is not. Well, couldn't agree with you more on that one. Before I let you go today, I'd like to get your views on the other potential war that is getting a lot of ink here in the United States anyway, and in the Middle East, and that is potential war between United States and Iran. It's not even the U.S. and Israel against Iran. It's right now, it's just the United States. We seem to be plunging headlong into this with no allies, no regional allies, no, it's Israeli allies. They said that if they get attacked, they'll respond. But so far, the only thing anybody's talking about is an American, which by itself is a big red flag. Earlier today on Fox News, General Jack Keane laid out what he sees as the potential scale of an attack by the United States to have the offensive punch to really conduct not a strike, but a campaign against Iran, which would likely last not for a couple of days, but actually longer than that. And that means to take down the civilian military leadership, all these repressive organizations, to include the IRGC, that have been punishing the people, killing somewhere between 10 to 30,000. We don't know the exact number, but even the lower number is completely staggering. 40,000 jailed as a result of it, and also destroy their ballistic missile systems, which they have been managing to recover since June. And I would imagine, given the indication that you just made, Maria, about activity at the nuclear sites, that they would finish off whatever recovery Iran is doing. This is a comprehensive plan to actually take Iran off the board. No president has had this opportunity. This president does. Now let me ask you the question from a slightly different perspective as a friend of the United States and somebody who wants global peace anyway. But is a friend of the United States, when you hear advocates like this, and there's several others that I could have shown you because there's been many that are just screaming for war with Iran in the United States today, when you hear him talk about taking Iran off the board and destroying their regime, and that he doesn't want diplomacy, that because in a separate interview, he said, even if you had a diplomatic outcome and you got what you asked for, all that's going to do is buy more time, and the regime itself has to be destroyed. This is a full-on war, and we're not being the United States. We're not being threatened. There's no war being threatened against us. There is no UN action. There's no legal basis for it, just taking a country off the board, as he phrased it. Does that give you any concern about the future of the United States when you hear advocates like this? Well, of course it does. First of all, I mean, you're very right to point out that this is not a war for which there is any legal or, by the way, moral justification. And I, who am a friend of the United States, care about that. I do not want the United States to get into a situation where it is conducting wars which have no moral or legal justification at all, and where there is no attempt to create it, which is what is even more alarming. I mean, no doubt very terrible things have been done inside Iran itself, but these are not considered a grounds for conducting war. The United States created many of these legal principles that are supposed to prevent this kind of war. So it upsets me terribly when it looks as if it is the United States itself that's going to break them. That is one. But the other thing is that what General Keane is talking about is a war, basically an unlimited, open-ended war to defeat. And Iran, not just to defeat Iran, but to destroy the entire government there and to, as he put it, take Iran off the table. Well, the Iranians are going to respond to that, and they're going to try to defend themselves. If the United States takes off the gloves and acts without limits, the Iranians, one must assume, are going to do the same. Now, possibly, as I suspect he believes, Iran is very fragile and will simply collapse as soon as this starts. But that is a gamble. We don't know that that is true. What if Iran proves much stronger and more resilient than he imagines, just as Russia has done in Ukraine? What if they do start taking action like, for example, closing the Straits of Hormuz or doing things of that kind? What is the plan for that? In that case, are we going to go on for further and greater escalation, which would, of course, compound the risks and might make all sorts of problems with our allies, our friends, people in the Middle East as well? Or do we draw back, in which case probably definitely that would be the right thing to do. But then in that case, it would be, I'm going to use very gentle word here, embarrassing for the United States, to say the least. Others would say humiliating. And I don't want that to happen to the United States either. Yeah, that would be more humble. That would be more in the humiliating category. In the embarrassing category has already happened because last week in Senate testimony, Secretary of State Marco Rubio was testifying, talking about the Venezuelan situation. But at the opportunity, one of the senators asked him, oh, by the way, in the event that we go to war with Iran and we take out the regime, what is the plan? And he literally said, I don't know. We don't have one. No one can say. So you are embarking on a plan right now. And whether Keene's saying this or not, the force deployment and the effort and the conversation makes it very clear that regime change is the objective. And you are telling me ahead of time we don't have a plan for what comes next. What do you think when you hear that, especially in the lessons that were learned after the 2003 Iraq War? Well, I think that is a disastrous thing. I mean, to go to war without a plan. I mean, that seems to me absolutely extraordinary and beyond dangerous. It sounds incredibly arrogant, completely detached from reality again. And to me, it sets up the whole situation for a total disaster. And I don't want to see a disaster. I don't want to see a disaster for the Iranians, for the people of Iran, who one should not forget or overlook. I don't want to see a disaster for the region. And of course, I don't want to see a disaster for the United States, which could have repercussions all around the world. And let me ask you before we let you go here, last question here is the fact that the United States is going this alone. No European allies, no Middle Eastern allies, none of our regional allies, and not even Iran, Israel, in terms of two co-belligerents going at it together. Like, that's the plan right now. It's just us by ourselves. Why do you suppose that even our greatest European ally, UK, is not saying we're in this with you, we'll do it? Well, because they're probably calculating and assessing the risks. And there must also be, in Europe, concerns that this is going to be unpopular and that there might be widespread opposition, which I suspect there would be. But there are probably also some people, at least in the foreign ministries, who are saying there are no grounds for this war. The grounds for it do not exist, and there might be major legal and political problems if we do this going forward, just as there were following the war in Iraq. And correct me if I'm wrong, and I recall what maybe a month and a half or so ago when the U.S., before it launched the operation in Venezuela, was launching this to basically summary execute people who were accused of running drugs in boats, and the UK came out and said, we're not going to participate in that anymore. They very quietly just kind of backed out of the way. That to me was a big first step, that at least the UK is not just willing to say, sure, whatever the US says, we're going to be involved with it. And they backed off out of that. Is this kind of in that same category here of, except maybe a little more important? And I think absolutely. I mean, one of the major events, one of the major consequences of the Iraq War was that a whole raft of political careers were destroyed because legal advice that the war was illegal was not followed. And in fact, there were attempts to try to get that legal advice changed. So this is something that is burnt into the minds of even the most cynical people here. And I think that is probably acting as a major restraint. And is this a harbinger of things to come? I mean, what if the United States does take this action anyway, and all of a sudden we start to really suffer and Iran hits and hurts us in the region, and we say, hey, we need our allies, UK, we need your help. Is UK going to participate? Then, well, then I'm going to say, if we have a situation where there's already a disaster working the sentiment amongst people in Britain, including, I suspect, many people with a political class, is that we should stay out. We should not get drawn into something that is going so badly wrong, at which point the United States will be even more by itself than it is already, because it would seem to me, and if I'm putting myself in a UK position, if I was telling you, don't do this, and I'm not going to be with you if you do, and then you do it anyway, and then call for us to come help, and I would have to reply in ways that could cause British service members to be killed in action, I would have a real hard time selling that at home, that we're going to sacrifice British soldiers for something that we tried to tell you not to do. Seems like there'd be a lot of pressure on the UK to stay out, like you say. I mean, it would be, I think, almost an impossible thing to sell. I think that there is no support for this war, for Britain being involved in this war in Britain. So far, nobody's suggesting it. And I mean, there are people in Britain who dislike Iran, and there are people in Britain, I call them false friends, by the way, who are urging the United States to go ahead and launch this war by itself. But nobody's suggesting that Britain should be involved. And if we ever got to a point where it was seriously suggested that Britain should be involved, I think there would be enormous opposition here. You know, Lindsey Graham over the weekend said that this whole situation here is like a seminal moment for President Trump. And he meant it one way, but I think in a different way. He is absolutely right. If President Trump makes this decision here and Iran does what it's very well could do, and that is fight back as you suggest, because there's almost no reason for them to withhold anymore if we attack with an intent, like Jack Keane says, to eradicate their regime. I mean, they're incentivized to respond back. And if they do, this could be a seminal moment, because if we don't have allies now and nobody wants to join in a losing conflict here, this could just completely, not just President Trump's term, but this could just upset a lot of Western world. I mean, I think, well, I hope he's getting that advice, because I completely agree. I hope that there are people in the White House and in the administration who are explaining to him that the risks for him personally, I mean, maybe that's not something that is the most important thing, but for him personally, the risks are extremely great. And to the extent that he still has a domestic agenda, which he wants to push forward with, well, that agenda is going to fail if he gets drawn into this war in exactly the same way the President Lyndon Johnson's agenda in the 1960s Annali basically failed because of the Vietnam War. That's a really good analogy, because everything LBJ wanted to do with this great society and all that was significantly curtailed by his involvement in there, and ended up cutting short his own tenure. He almost certainly could have won a second term, but we'll hope that that stays a historical analogy and that sanity will prevail. If it hasn't in Europe over the last 4 years, maybe it will in Washington, and we won't have to get into this war with Iran to find out. But in any case, as always, we're very grateful for your great insights here, and we'll tell people to go back and look at the Duran, where you're the co-host, and at the Alexander Mercurius YouTube channel, to where all kinds of great stuff you can see every day. You can get your fill of Alexander Mercurius. We love to go there too. Thanks, Alexander. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much, Daniel. A pleasure, as always, to be on your program. And just a reminder, we are on YouTube. And obviously, you know YouTube. We are on podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You'll find us here. Share this with your friends. Folks, we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you even tough topics like the one today, and we don't hold any punches back, because we want people to be clear-eyed and understand what we're facing before we get into a difficult time. Share this with somebody, whenever format that they may have it, because they deserve to see the same thing you do. Thanks very much, folks. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.